Grab one more.
You all are live.
Okay, do we have Chairman Perkins on board yet?
Mr. Chairman, he's not in the meeting yet.
I just talked to him on the phone, so.
No. Regarding 173? Yeah, we want to do this first.
We do, okay.
Yeah. I mean, this may help 173.
That's what I was wondering. Would you want to turn your microphone?
Amanda, have you sent the Zoom link to Senator Perkins?
I believe he should have it, but I can definitely resend it to him if he needs it. Don, I just sent him the link.
Thank you.
He's joining right now.
We see you, Mr. Co-Chair.
So I'm here. Mr. Co-Chair, how are you?
Excellent, excellent. We've got everybody in tow.
Okay.
So we'll proceed. So if you would, Dave, could you just walk us through what you've been working on and then take us to the documents you've provided us.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, you should have 3 documents in front of you. The JCC report, the engrossed copy of the bill with the JCC report enrolled into it in red, and then a chart that Don prepared that shows the conflicts between 121 and House Bill 173 over OPSA. And how would you like to proceed, Mr. Chairman? Walking through the JCC? Or do you want to talk about OPSA first?
You have a preference?
I just soon go through the JCC so we know where we thought we were at after we kind of some informal discussions.
Okay, please proceed.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, walking through the JCC, you delete all three House amendments. That's the Standing Committee Amendment, the Summers Amendment, and the Zwaniter Amendment. 90% of the House Amendment comes back in. The Zwaniter Amendment comes back in completely with some conforming changes. And the Summers Amendment goes away in the JCC. I'll take just a little longer than I normally would on the title, Mr. Chairman, because it really explains the bill in large part. Looking at the bill, page 1, lines 1 through 3, you're still modifying the spending policies. So the bill ends up with 5% for all three spending policies. You remove the step down. JCC in the bill, page 1, lines 3 through 5, you're removing the repeal of the SIPA that the Senate had inserted. You're removing the repeal of the sub-accounts within the SIPA. On page 1, lines 5 through 7, you are still repealing the deficit control account, and that's the Zwaniter Amendment adopted by the House. Page 1, lines 7 and 8.
So Dave, if I can interrupt, Dave, so I know this isn't in the change, but with the strikeout of basically all of page 4 and then lines 1 and 2 of page 5, and then we leave quite a bit of language in 94719 where we're anyway. Could you help us understand what so like going to starting on the page 5 line 4 down through that, what that does now with where we're at with the amendments and the other strikeouts, if you can.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, turning to the bill on page 4 lines, or page 4 and then carrying on to page 5 lines 1 and 2. That's removed from the bill. It had been included because SIPA was being repealed. And what actually is, there's an additional repealer that's removed from the bill, and that's the guarantee for SIPA. And so that's back in the law. Now, Mr. Chairman Perkins, on page 5, line 4, carrying over to page 6, line 8, those are the spending policies being placed at 5% throughout.
Yeah, so we're just marrying up and just making those spending policies consistent through the various permanent funds.
Mr. Chairman, for all three, the higher education
Okay,
and the common school, 5% all the way through perpetually until you change it.
okay.
On page 1, line 8 through 10, that strike is because when you put in the SIPA repeal, we were transferring funds, and without the SIPA repeal, that goes away. Page 1, line 10, you still have redistributing certain severance taxes, and we'll get to that later in the very end of the bill. Transferring funds is specified. That goes to removing the OPSTA. You're not transferring any 1% severance tax account monies in this bill. Whatever you do with the 1% account will be determined between the House Bill 173 and the budget bill, Mr. Chairman. Page 1, lines 12 through 13, the Senate had placed in the bill provision that this bill will control any other bill. You remove that in this JCC. And so whatever you do in House Bill 173, well, first of all, this doesn't deal anything with 1% anymore. So the 1% is either going to be covered by the budget bill, or it'll be covered if you address it in House Bill 173.
Well, I thought yesterday when Mr. Co-Chair, I thought when we spoke informally yesterday, we actually talked about making deposits or doing something with the office, and we were actually talking about. Anyway, that's a bit of a surprise to me, but okay.
I'm confused.
So anyway, continue on.
Well,
Okay, Mr.
go
Chairman,
ahead.
and let me distinguish here between the 1% account that holds money and the 1% revenue stream. The revenue stream is addressed later on in the bill. That's the redistribution of severance taxes, Mr. Chairman. So it's important to distinguish between those two concepts, the one holding the money and the one letting the money come in, the revenue stream.
Okay,
Okay, Mr. Chairman, on the JCC, that takes you over to page 2, line 22 amendment. And there you're simply inserting realized losses, investment losses. That was done in the House Standing Committee amendment.
which was always, I think that was always the intent. I mean, ultimately, those interpretive policies only dealt with realized losses. So that's just, I look at that as more of a technical correction than anything.
Mr.
agree.
Chairman, I think it's technical. I think it's neither here nor there because the only way you have a debit under the state treasurer's policy is if you have a realized loss.
Okay.
So it's a clarification, yes. On page 3, line 16, on the JCC through page 3, line 21 are simply conforming amendments for the title and the provisions that are affected. I'll skip over those unless you want to walk through them, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
Okay, page 4, lines 4 through 22, page 5, lines 1 and 2 were addressed in response to Chairman Perkins' question. It is the guarantee for the SIPA. Since SIPA is not going away, the guarantee provisions are back in law. They come out of the bill. Page 5, line 4 through page 6, line 8, the spending policies that we talked about.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Groover and Mr. Richards. So, I mean, what do you guys have an estimate on what the revenue effects on the spending policy are in each account? I mean, I understand it's an estimate, but we get it on the 1%, but I'd like to understand what the dollar amount estimates are, or the effect of changing the spending policy during those years.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I think a good opportunity to consider there is the difference between, it only affects really 2 years immediately, the 1% versus the 1.25%. So in fiscal year 2022, there is no difference. Fiscal year 2023, there is 1/8 of 1% difference, which is approximately $10 million. And in fiscal year 2024 and thereafter, it's approximately $20 million, which was equal to 1/2 of 1, or 1/4 of 1/2 of 1%. Excuse me, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Co-Chair?
Go ahead.
And Dawn, just to make sure, you're talking about the effect on the permanent trust fund. That's what you're referring to with what you just told us, right? That's the permanent fund to which you're referring. Is that correct?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, let me be a little bit more specific. I didn't have these numbers quite correct. On the permanent side, it would be $20 million per year in fiscal year 23 and $40 million per year in each fiscal year thereafter. On the common school account, it would essentially be half of that, $10 million per year, but that doesn't kick in until fiscal year 2025. And then in fiscal year 2026 and thereafter, it would be $20 million.
And that's because what this does, it avoids the step down that was in those years from 5 to 4.75 and then to 4.5. Is that why does that account for the difference?
That is correct.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead.
so just to ask another, carry on with that thought then. So really, as we look to the next budget, All right, so we're in what, 21, 22 budget. So as you look to 23, 24 budget, without this change, then there's going to be a $60 million drop off in general fund or SIPA revenues. No? I guess, yeah, tell me the general fund part of that. Yeah, it's going to be about 10 and about 30 million a biennium, I think. 10 and 20, is that right?
Mr. Chairman, and that's actually the question I started to respond to the first time. It would be on the SIPA account because the general fund is going to stay at 2.5%.
That's right.
SIPA account only would profile an additional $30 million.
30 million.
10 million in the first year, 20 million in the second year. No change on the schools because the step down doesn't start next biennium, but the following biennium, it would be 30 million there because 10 million the first year, 20 million in FY26. So we're getting out there a ways.
Okay, and Mr. Chairman, but it would affect school CapCon as 0.45% of the SIPA.
Mr. Chairman, that is correct. So 0.45% of the 30 million,
15
approximately
million,
14 million. Yeah.
So we're gonna have a bigger deficit on the school CapCon side if we don't do this, basically, taking away revenue.
Mr. Chairman, you'll have a bigger deficit if you do not
Yeah,
adopt this.
correct. If we do not, thank you.
And so part of the tie-in with doing, at least part of our comments were, if we do this first now, before 173 is fully and finally resolved, if it is, this provides at least a bump in the deficit issues that they're trying to address. Because if we don't do this, we're just adding to the problem of 173. Is that a fair characterization of it? Don?
Mr. Chairman, I don't have any opinion on which you do first, but any action that you do here will increase available revenue to be profiled going forward. I would also add the corollary to that is you're going to draw down the reserve accounts at a faster rate.
Question?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So, Mr. Chairman, I guess the thing that I'm wondering about in the interplay between this bill and 173 is that the federal ARP money that's just flooding into our schools right now and just looking at that it's very possible that that money could supplant any reductions that might be made and provide extra revenue. And if we don't find a way to put some of that in a reserve account, it's my understanding that they could even get as much as double of, they would get their state funding and then a federal match. Am I understanding that correctly? And if so, is our timing on this right, I guess, is my question. So whomever can answer it.
I think, and I'll ask some more on that question, just to get it clarified. So I think we're kind of thinking the same thing. Those education ARP dollars are about 300 million. So about 10% of the biennial number. Are those going to be but those are, there's a maintenance effort. So the word supplant, I'm really careful with, and I just want to ask about that. But then, and of course that's different across different, so it's about 10% of the biennial budget. That's my first deal. And then are they distributed from the state superintendent though? I don't think those are going to flow right to school districts. Are they, or is that going to be more of a reimbursement program? Do we know that yet, or is there? So to kind of continue on with the good senator's question.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, several concepts there. So let me take them one at a time. Your first comment about the changes here you're making to this spending policy equate to about $30 million per year on the school side, or excuse me, $30 million per year per biennium on the school side, but that does not begin until 2025.
Okay.
There you go.
So it's after the federal funds are available. It does happen to be 10% of that amount, but no interaction there.
So, Mr. Chairman, can I just quit on that point, Mr. Chairman?
Go ahead.
Thank you. And so Donna, just to go back and make sure I understood what you just said. So with respect to the spending policy, which is what this section deals with, is that there's no step down in this until until any biennium or any year after the ARPA money is distributed. And so ultimately, the effect of the spending policy on education funding, it doesn't affect it, because there's no effect on this until those out years, which are, like say, the ARP money is come and gone and done whatever's been done with it. Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, with respect to the spending policy, you're exactly correct.
Okay.
A couple more.
Go ahead.
Several more points, because the questions there need to kind of be unpacked one at a time. The second point I have is relative to maintenance of effort on the school side. That applies to K-12 and higher education. That maintenance of effort is a spending calculation only. It is not a revenue calculation. So regardless of OPSTA money or spending policy money or transfers, that, in my opinion, does not affect the MOE, maintenance of effort, because the maintenance of effort is a spending decision, not a revenue decision. The next item I wanted to mention is the issue of supplant. That word does not appear in the federal legislation. It could in future guidance, but right now there's no comment or prohibition for supplanting, and arguably the Senate amendment on House Bill 173, not the bill before you, attempts to restrict a like amount of state funds into a revenue account or a reserve account at the district level. That's not before you today, but that's in a different committee. The last point I might make is there is a revenue determination on the general fund side for federal funds. So in addition to the $300 million that is going to K-12, there's $1.075 billion that will come to the state. And the permissible uses for those funds are triggered by a revenue calculation. Again, we don't have any guidance on that, but it's quite possible that operating revenues, and maybe all revenues of the state, will impact that and that calculation. And that is why staff have suggested for maximum flexibility for fiscal year 22 and 23, it might be beneficial to not deposit funds into operating accounts, which your joint conference committee here on House Bill 1 and House Bill 73 all avoid. It may not help us, but it potentially is additional flexibility for what those funds can be used for.
And Don, just to clarify, when you say operating accounts, you're talking about general fund. What else?
Mr. Chairman, the general fund, the SIPA, and the school foundation program for sure are, and school capital construction, all four of those are checking accounts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I got one technical question and then another conceptual one. So the technical one is, where is the step down repealed in here? Because I've never been able to find it, and I Maybe I'm just reading it wrong, but I'm not seeing the 4.75 or the 4.5 anywhere in this bill. And so there's no repealers. I'm just not seeing it.
The repealers of the step down show up on page 13, lines 15 through 17. There are other provisions in there that are repealed, but that's where the step down repealers are.
That's why I missed it.
And along those same lines, Mr. Chairman, when we talk about, well, the step downs go away for the permanent and the common school, the excellence in higher education, you're already at 4 3/4. And this takes that up to 5%. As Don explained, I don't think it has any effect, but just so you know that that's the timing and that's the status.
Okay, further questions?
Yep. Thank you,
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman. So, the way I've always thought about this bill is it's taking out by repealing the step down a certain amount. We're gaining a little bit of liquidity with that provision. And in exchange, we're losing liquidity with the OPSTA exchange. And so that's kind of the way I've understood this trade-off in this bill. And what I want to understand is how close is it to 1-to-1? Because the way it appears to be suggested is that repealing the step down, we gain about 60 million in liquidity, but we're depositing 70 million out of the OPSTA. I mean, it depends on the year, obviously, and we're getting into projections, but if there's any way when we discuss this, let's forget the accounts that it's being deposited into, but this OPSTA versus spending step down repeal issue, how much liquidity do we gain in each year from the spending step down repeal versus losing to the OPSTA? Take the accounts out of it, and how close is it to 1-to-1? And that's what I've always been trying to understand in this bill, and is a little bit cryptic.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Gray, as to the step down, after you get out there 4 years, after all that is resolved, it works out to be about $90 million, doing some quick math here. As to the 1% severance tax in that out year, it's approximately $80 million. So it's close to 1-to-1, but not identical.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I think though part of this story is really what grows the accounts the most. And I think that's where we're in this, where we want to grow the permanent funds, but we also want to, use the investment income for today's people, right? And so as you look over that, and I've shared this with, I think the senators, I think Steinmetz yesterday, I think I sent it to you and maybe Senator Perkins, but you just look at the history of this. And if you look at the growth of the Permanent Mill Trust Fund, really over the last 17 years, about if by not having a 4.5% spending policy, we grew the trust fund by about 380 million. We would have grown it by about 580 million. I think LSO Fiscals put all this together. So about 210 million less was deposited with tips over these 17 years. But if you look at what the 1% deposit did, which increases your deposit by like over 40%, it's over $1.5 billion in 10 years. And so how we've really grown the fund is the 1%. It's not the spillover tips that take time and go through, and sometimes they don't go, they go back and they forth, but that 1% is deposited every year. The little spillover, it takes a long time for it to finally get topped and over. So I think the answer that Mr. Richards gave kind of shows a 1-to-1, but I think in the long term, the savings benefit of the 1% is huge compared to trying to give ourselves a haircut on a pay cut on the 0.5% spending policy. So that's why we're trying to reach a sweet spot between our two bodies and try to do the right thing on all this, save for the future, but use some of this revenue for today's people too. That's the moral question. I mean, today's taxes, should they be used for today's people? And
Mr.
so thank you.
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead.
thank you, Mr. Chairman. And just to follow up on Representative Harshman's point, I would add a couple of thoughts. And one is that that severance taxes by their nature are taxes off a depleting asset. And so I've always thought, and of course I come from the background of being a trust lawyer, but I've always thought, and certainly you can find in statute and what they call the Uniform Income Principal and Income Act, you can find this concept that when you have a depleting asset, that a certain amount of that depleting asset belongs to the future generations. It belongs to the future beneficiaries of that, and so it requires even competent trust law endowments require some portion of that to be retained for future generations, that the current income beneficiaries don't necessarily have the right to that. And so when you do that, coming back to what Representative Harshman just said, is if we can take the 1% severance tax and we deposit that to where it can be invested and make income, that's forever. And the income from that is forever. Whereas if we take the 1% severance tax and spend it as we go along, it's one time and you spend it and it's gone. And so just trying to mesh those 2 points, I think it just amplifies what the former speaker, Representative Harshman, just said, was trying to find this balance where we spend the income but save for the future with the 1% severance tax is a huge thing. If we can save $1 billion in the next 10 years, whether it's in the 1%, whether it's in the permanent mineral trust fund or it's in the common school permanent land fund, that's if you have a 4 or 5% spending policy on $1 billion, is $40 to $50 million a year, $180 to $100 million a biennium, without ever taxing a dime from the citizens of the state of Wyoming. And so how we do this and how we work for the future has tremendous ramifications in a little bit, not even in the long term, just even in the short term for the citizens of Wyoming.
Go ahead, please.
With that said, I think that's where Senate Appropriations has been heading. We've had some good conversations about that in the hallway and in our body, Senator Cooper. So I guess my question is, what are your thoughts on this bill controlling rather than 173 and putting that language back in?
I think the easy answer to that, Mr. Co-Chair, is we're going to take these funds and put them into permanent savings, the 1% in this bill, so that even without 173, then this would control, and we're going to save that 1% into permanent funds. Now, if there is immediate need in 173 to not withstand or to capture those funds that are necessary in order to resolve the current educational issue on a short time basis, so be it. But this is really the long-term picture that we're working with here. Does that help?
A little bit.
Yeah, please, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Richards, so I think I know the answer to this, but I'm always been very perplexed by the repeal of the deficit control account in here. My understanding is that this summer would have been the first time that there would have been a deposit into this account. And we heard, well, there's no money in there in the House. Well, that would have started this summer, right?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Gray, you're correct. There was a delayed effective date on the legislative deficit control account. So the first calculation would have occurred on June 30th of this calendar year. I don't believe that there would be any deposit on June 30th because it is of the unobligated, unencumbered balance. And the legislature has spent the SIPA down such that no funds under our calculation would be anticipated to be deposited until June 30th, 2022. You're exactly right. The calculation would have occurred for the first time this year, but that calculation, you end up with a negative number, so you can't have a negative deposit. And so the first time we would have anticipated a deposit would be next year.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a question for the bringer of the bill. I've never understood this. I mean, why would, if the position of the Senate is to repeal SIPA, why would you want to repeal an account that was a distribution out of SIPA if ultimately the bill is not going to repeal SIPA?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Chairman, Representative Gray, the answer to that question is there's two parts to it. One is that the LSRA, the Legislative Stabilization Reserve Account, is essentially and always has been a deficit control act. It's what it is. It's to provide stabilization for legislative revenues. And so it's to some degree, so that's part of it. And then the other one is that the Senate had always thought that if we could simplify the number of accounts, the number of places, the number of coffee cans that the legislature funnels and stores money, that it would make the budget a little bit simpler and a little bit more straightforward. But that's an opinion or and in fact, even the revocation of the SIP, even before we had drained the SIP in large part through actions taken in the budget bill, was ultimately we had a bill that actually revoked the SIPA. That's all it did, and simply took the SIPA money and put it in the LSRA. So at the end of the day, the Senate has been trying to push money into the LSRA and away from these other accounts if it's not going to be expended in the current budget. And that's a little bit of a difference between the majority of the House and the majority of the Senate. And so in doing this bill, I mean, we're trying to find a compromise between the two positions in the respective houses. Neither one is, they're both a matter of philosophy. Neither one's right or wrong, but they're both a matter of philosophy about what's in the best interest of the state of Wyoming. Certainly room for reasonable people to disagree on those two philosophies.
Okay, where are we at?
Mr. Chairman, I am after page 7, lines 6 through 10 on the JCC, going on over to page 13, lines 4 through 6. But before I get there, I'll speak quickly about those pages that aren't amended in between. All of those are statutory trust funds. And what we try to do there is get the language uniform and make them consistent with the provisions you'll find on page 2 and 3 of the bill. And what those do is specify how the treasurer, when the treasurer will credit to the various accounts earnings. And I'll just talk about quickly because I had some legislative inquiries and you might get those on the floor. But what we tried to do was take the treasurer's current policy, including the Myers policy as amended by the Gordon policy, and put those in the statutes. And that allows what I'll call ordinary income. It's not ordinary for the IRS purposes, but ordinary incomes, interest, dividends, rents, to be distributed quarterly. Capital gains aren't distributed until the end of the year. And then further, if capital gain losses, realized capital gain losses under the treasurer's policy instituted by Meyer, was that he would hold as a debit against the account those losses. And before you could distribute capital gains in future years, you had to completely make those debits whole. And that's what pages 2 and 3 do. You separate the two types of income, and then capital gains are treated differently as far as being held as a debit to the account and then being repaid. And all those pages in between are just statutory trust funds where we conform them to that policy and those timings. That takes me to page 13, Mr. Chairman, which really begins on page 12, the provision, and this is your 1% stream. And then the 1% stream for fiscal years 2021 and 22, they go to the 1% severance tax account. That provision on page 13, lines 4 through 6 are removed from the bill. And then on page 8 through 11, the Summers Amendment goes away, the Senate position goes away, and what you have on the JCC is a new distribution of the 1%, starting in 2023, fiscal year 2023, 50% to the Permanent Mineral Trust Fund, 50% to the Common School account within the Permanent Land Fund. And then after 10 years, 2/3 goes to the Permanent Mineral Trust Fund, 1/3 to the Common School account, Mr. Chairman.
So questions? Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, I was wondering if, Dave, if you could go through all the repealers, just hit the high notes of what those are.
Mr. Chairman, I'll be glad to. Senator, page 13, line 15, that's 719, all the way through 02 on line 16, repealers of the step downs. Down to 4 3/4, down to 4 1/2. The repealer of Q3 is just executed provision for 2019 only. 118B is just a conforming amendment for the state fair account, which is just what I talked about 5 minutes ago. And then 801B 1 through 3 are just old distributions of the 1%. And so they're just repealed as obsolete. And then, Mr. Chairman, the JCC, page 13, lines 19 and 20, you repeal or remove lines 19 and 20 because some of those dealt with the SIPA repeal, which is no longer in the bill. And instead you put in the Zwaniter repeal of the deficit control account. And that's what page 13, lines 19 through and 20 do with that insertion.
Thank you.
Page 13, lines 22 and 23, that deals with your ops distributions as was in the budget bill last year. Again, ops is completely now out of this bill. And then you're just dealing with renumbering up until page 20, line 3, Mr. Chairman. And what that does is make effective immediately the effective date provision, the study provision, and the repeal of the deficit control account. And then, Mr. Chairman, the only other thing I'd mention is the one provision that's effective immediately is the study. And this has the Select Finance Committee studying a multitude of issues dealing with earnings, income, distributions, and as Senator Perkins said earlier, what should go to current beneficiaries, what should go to future beneficiaries? What does it mean when an account is inviolate? And finally, one of the reasons that started this entire bill, Mr. Chairman, is how does the state, if the state can move to an endowment concept in which a certain percentage of the value of the fund is distributed each year, regardless of income and earnings, but just a certain hard percentage is distributed. Can the state do that without constitutional amendments? And if not, what constitutional amendments and possibly changes to the act of admission would be required to implement some kind of an endowment concept?
I just have a question on that. What is the difference between this study and the one in 219 and 244?
Mr. Chairman, 244 looks at the management and the structure for the management of all state fund investments. How could we do it more efficiently? Can we do it more efficiently? How should it be staffed? Should we have an independent entity or what have you do it? This looks at the legalities as opposed to the functionality of investments. What can we do under the legal framework? How would the legal framework have to be changed to reach various goals?
Thank you.
Well, let's finish the discussion now. Okay, anything else on the bill?
Mr. Chairman, for some reason I skipped over the section 7 removal, which is, and you talked about it, but it is, the Senate put in that this bill will trump on page 16, lines 1 through 8. Any other bill in conflict, this JCC removes that from the bill. Now, there shouldn't be a conflict with the 1% severance tax account because it's out of the bill completely. But that's not in the bill any longer, Mr. Chairman. Again, the House Bill 1 and House Bill 173 would control.
And House Bill 1 just goes through the end of the biennium on the 1%, right?
Correct, Mr. Chairman.
And that distribution is 50-50?
Mr. Chairman, that's correct. 50-50 to permanent corpus.
Okay. Any further questions? Any further questions? Okay, Representative Gray would like to make a motion.
Well, I guess I haven't been on one of these in a while. I just want to talk about the deficit control account. So I do that anytime if we need to put this on the tables.
Go ahead, jump in.
Well, I don't really.
Put your mic on.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I would just like to move that we remove the repealer of the deficit control account and place that into the proposed amendment, that we do not get rid of it. I think there's reasons to have it. LISRA, there's a lot of disagreement on what it's there for. Some people think it's there to backfill deficits. I think in a period of deficits, I've said this many times on the floor, that is my opinion, what it's there for. However, most other people, I think, at least on the House side, feel that it is an account that can be used for distributions into bills. And I don't feel that way. I've voted against that, I think, almost every time. So the whole idea of the deficit control account is we create a sub account that is very clearly for backfilling our deficit. The other thing I like about it is that I ultimately think the middle ground on this whole thing is to put the 1% into an account that must be invested, but not to take it off the table entirely by putting into the permanent fund. And I think the only way to do that is to bifurcate that within LISRA to make sure that it's not going to be liquid. And I know LISRA can be invested, and I'm not a master at the level that they do that because there's cash in there. Okay, there's a lot in there. And so I think the best way to do that is to bifurcate that and to create an account that must be invested. And yes, at one point it could be taken out, but you would have to get to 500 million first. And I don't understand the Senate position. I'm very perplexed on, it seems to oscillate from year to year. I think I understand what the House position is, even though I don't agree with it. But the Senate position on on what we're going to do fiscally from 30,000 feet up is very perplexing to me, and it seems to be changing. But I don't think it's good for us to lock these up forever. I think it's very clear that that's the House position. I think the deficit control account is a good tool for multiple reasons, and I just think we should take the repealer out. So thank you.
Is there a second on the motion? Seeing no second, that motion fails. No, go ahead and respond.
Mr. Chairman, I think we should put the conference report on the table first, and I think we can
Yeah,
try to
okay.
amend that, and you asked that earlier. But I think
That's probably the proper
it's
protocol.
probably the way to do that.
Can we, we're gonna have someone move the
So
conference report?
I'll move the conference committee report.
We have a second? Seconded by Senator Cooper. Okay, now we'll just incorporate
then-
your discussion.
And so that, Mr. Chairman, just so I understand, that'd be on page 2, page 13, lines 19 and 20, which is on page 2 of the conference committee report.
And the question would be, I think you mentioned that that there's other places in where this is addressed, so. Dave?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, the title would have to be conformed, and there are the title would have to be conformed, and there's a couple other places. But I mean, if that's what you do conceptually, we can certainly draft a new JCC for you.
Okay, so the motion is to, we'll just bring it back up from Representative Gray to reinsert the deficit spending account and conform accordingly. All right? All right, so let's just take a vote on. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, no?
No,
No. That motion fails. Any other motions? So, Mr. Co-Chair, I think we're at the point now that what's the pleasure of the Senate? Would you like to meet with your folks and have some discussions about this? See how it lines up with 173 and just get a comfort zone with everybody before we circulate
Yes,
a report?
Mr. Co-Chair, yes, it would be, although before we break up, I would like Dave to explain again the difference between the 1% severance account and then apparently then the distributions.
Can you say that again? When you turned away from your computer, we lost your sentence.
Well, that's probably a good thing, but yeah, if Dave could really explain the distinction between the 1% severance account and then the distributions from the 1% severance account, and help us understand one more time when we take the OPSTA is no longer in, but yet the distributions are. Help us understand that one more time.
Mr. Chairman, it really is a matter, as Don pointed out to me, of timing and which year you're talking about. In fiscal impact, Senator, I'll turn over to Don. The change really, Mr. Chairman, appears on page 13. Currently, you have money within the 1% severance tax. As the JCC is written, this would continue the deposits to the 1% severance tax account through fiscal year 2022. Thereafter, the stream changes to the permanent funds. Mr. Chairman, as far as and then the budget bill for the 1% of last year and has changed by this year, I think, do you still have the April and later? You have an April distribution from the 1% existing monies in the account to the permanent funds 50/50. And then again, you have a distribution, when is that done? Okay, October 2023, whatever remaining funds are in the 1%. And then from there on out, you would have the change made to the permanent funds on page 2, paragraphs 5 and 6 of the 1% stream, then flowing 50/50, and then later, after 10 years, 2/3, 1/3. Does that help, Senator?
So, Mr. Chairman and Chairman Perkins, so here's how I want to restate that. This is what I think you said. And this takes place after this budget. Right now, the OPSTA is a creation only in the budget. It's not in the green books. We started it 5 years ago when we were running into tough fiscal times. So this takes over at the end of this current budget. And then if the legislature chooses to recreate the OPSTA and House Bill 1 again or Senate File 1, they can do that. But This doesn't even touch that budget bill language at all.
Mr. Chairman, that's exactly right, and a lot more succinct. But if you recreate the 1% after this budget year, you'd have to come in and change the green books here because now you've set it up for after that to go to the permanents, have 50-50.
And
So,
yeah,
Mr. Chairman, if I can,
Go ahead.
so I think, Mr. Chairman, I think the way I understood what was said is the distinction is that with reference to the account, the 1%, this is apportioning or directing the revenue to the revenue associated with the 1% severance tax into these places. But the account itself, which was just a holding account, that essentially would go away after this budget biennium. And after that, it's not really directing the account. The account could be recreated and could intercept those funds in the future. But as this bill would go out of here, it would be directing the 1% as indicated in the bill. Is that right?
Mr. Chairman, that is correct as I understand it. I advised Dave incorrectly. That's why I'm jumping in. It's for 21 and 22, and it would go away in October of 22.
Okay, I got it.
All right. Sure. Okay, anything else?
No, well, why don't we'll try and meet with our leadership and we'll try and obviously we need to meet again this afternoon and either do this or not do it. So, okay.
So we'll continue this meeting while we have our informal meetings. And as soon as you're ready to get back together, Drew, just let me know.
Okay, my guess is it'll probably be an hour or so. Okay.
Fair enough. Thank you.
All right, thanks.
Okay, we'll stand in recess